對照國安法嘅做法就係，你哋用返你哋自己對自己嘅責任，對社會嘅責任，對你嘅家庭嘅責任去做呢份工作。
Exactly a year ago today, Hong Kong media mogul Jimmy Lai was put on trial for conspiring to collude with foreign forces. Today, December 18th, 2024, the trial against Jimmy Lai and the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily continues. What has happened in the trial over the past year? You are listening to The Divide. My name is Iris Xu.
My name is Mark Sabah. I'm a director at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation.
The Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation was set up to fight for Hong Kong and its people as China continues its massive crackdown on the city. The foundation defends political prisoners held in Hong Kong and seeks to have them released. It also presses for political and economic consequences for China's failure to keep its promise regarding Hong Kong's freedoms. They support the rule of law, free media, and freedom of expression. They also urge the business community to stand against China's assault on freedom, which also imperils Hong Kong's status as an international center. And today, Mark is here to help me understand what kinds of impact the trial of Jimmy Lai has on Hong Kong as a city.
The trial has become a symbol of everything that's gone wrong with rule of law, justice, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly in Hong Kong since the introduction of the national security law. Now, one of the reasons why it has so much attention is because it's so emblematic of all the problems that Hong Kong has faced on those fronts, but also because Jimmy Lai was one of the most famous, influential, rich people in the city. And it was quite clear that the Hong Kong authorities, under the instructions of Beijing, had to bring down the most famous, influential person in order to bring everybody else in line. In fact, if you think about how many billionaire businessmen there are in Hong Kong, we haven't heard much from them in the last 4 or 5 years. Some of them are, own businesses all over the world, have interests not just in mainland China and in Hong Kong, but in the UK, America, possibly Taiwan. We haven't heard a peep from them for the last 4 years. And so the job of the authorities was exactly that. Let's throw the most influential, famous person in prison. Let's take away his rights. Let's throw all sorts of charges at him. And let's absolutely silence this idea that anyone is too big, too powerful, and that only the CCP, through the Hong Kong authorities, rules Hong Kong.
Hong Kong once prided itself on its independent judicial system that allowed the city to become an international financial center. But on May 30th, 2024, 14 of 45 activists were convicted and found guilty of conspiring to commit subversion under Hong Kong's national security law. While 2 activists were acquitted, the remaining 31 activists agreed to plead guilty. And on November 19th, 2024, the 45 convicted activists were handed down prison sentences between 4 and 10 years by the High Court. Were the verdict predetermined?
The verdict may not be, but the outcome was predetermined. They could not release them. They have to make an example of people who may be thinking again of, well, let's organize a primary, or let's just do a local election, or, let's try and get the press involved to support freedom of speech. So they had to be found guilty. The sentences are between 4 years and 10 years. Considering many of them have already been in prison for 2, 3, 4 years, you either see it as harsh or light, depending on your perspective. But I think that they could have all been let out, saying, you've already all been in prison for 4 years. You've learned your lesson, no more elections. The law has changed in any case. and therefore they should have all been released immediately. It's quite incredible that they're still being sentenced, even though some people have said, well, it's only 4 years. Yes, but it's 4 years on top of 4 years and so on. So my view is that it's too harsh. And remember, they were convicted for committing democracy in a city which allowed them to do it. They didn't break a law. They were acting within their rights to organize a primary. They were acting within their rights to, call for people to register to vote and so on. It wasn't anything illegal. And that's what makes the sentencing that much more shocking.
And given both Jimmy Lai and Hong Kong 47's cases, can we still consider Hong Kong's judicial system independent or fair?
I mean, a hand-picked judge for a particular case is never really a good sign. That's what they used to do in Russia and so on in the Soviet Union. So it's never really a good sign. Now, there are some people who are saying that if you are in a court in Hong Kong on a business issue, arbitration or commercial, everything is completely fine. But those cases follow laws which don't impact freedom of speech, democracy, freedom of assembly, and so on in a direct manner. If two businesses are arguing about intellectual property, or they're arguing about the size of a factory, or they're arguing about, you said you would deliver 10 tons and you only gave me 9 tons, those things don't require national security law interference yet. But at the moment, it's fairly clear that those things can in some way continue as normal. It becomes murky, muddy, and suspicious when you start talking of people's fundamental rights. So if it's written in the basic law in Hong Kong that you have the right to freedom of assembly, and so 100 people get together to sing a song and then they get arrested, and the judge finds them guilty, you have to immediately say something is suspicious about that. That's unusual behavior. And which judge who is genuinely following the law and has been through the education of the process of balancing out rights and wrongs and cause and effect and so on, how can you find people like that guilty? That's what's remarkable. So the issue of the national security judges is that their loyalty is to the national security law, not to the rule of law, if that makes sense.
But national security aside, Jimmy Lai was also found guilty of fraud and sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison because of a lease dispute.
Well, that's kind of the point, is that they needed to find anything to find Jimmy Lai guilty. He has 4 charges against him. 2 of them are national security law charges, and there was the fraud charge. The fraud charge related to the amount of space that he used for private business on a workspace. It's a bit like Al Capone being found guilty and sentenced for taxes in the end. It wasn't for murder, it wasn't for trafficking, it wasn't for anything else. They found him on a tax bill. They had to find him guilty of something. And because he wasn't guilty of anything other than reporting news and supporting democracy and attending rallies and attending vigils and so on, they had to come up with something that would make him look like a bad guy in the eyes of the Hong Kong people. And we have to remember that it's really important that that the authorities separated Jimmy from the public. It's important that to them that the public start thinking that he's a bad guy. Because if they think he's a bad guy, he loses popular support. And at the moment, even members of the average member of the public would have been outraged that somebody who was supporting the pro-democracy people has been thrown in jail, just the same as the 47, except he was even more famous and more influential. So the authorities had to find him guilty of something. And if they didn't find him guilty of fraud on a lease inside of his building, they would have found something else, like he jumped a red light one day in 1995 or something. I mean, they would have found something to make him guilty and to try and break the bond between him and his support for the public democracy movement.
So if authorities wanted to separate Jimmy Lai from the public, what are the responses from the Hong Kong people?
I think overall, from what we gather, is that the public are wise enough to know that the charges against him generally are nonsense. I mean, if you want to believe that he committed fraud and he supported all the, foreign collusion, etc., then you will believe it, right? There are some people who believe the American election was stolen. There are some people who believe that vaccines cause all sorts of... I mean, there's always going to be somebody who must support the authorities and the authority view. But on the whole, the public understand that he has now become almost a martyr for the cause of freedom and democracy. He's become a global symbol of standing up for freedom of speech and free press. You know, he's winning awards all over the world for his bravery in standing up for free speech, and journalists around the world are saying his name. So the irony of this whole exercise of the last 4 years is that with the authorities attempting to quiet down the name of Jimmy Lai, to stifle him, to put him away, and to end any attention on the pro-democracy movement, by putting him in jail and putting him on trial, and by throwing all these charges at him, it just almost elevated him to even more than he was to start with. So it was a gross miscalculation. They could have put him in jail for 6 months, slapped him on the wrist, shut down his newspaper, and expelled him from Hong Kong, for example. But by keeping him in prison for 4 years and then sentencing the 45, it reignited the whole thing all over again. It's real miscalculations by the authorities.
It seems like the Hong Kong authorities as well as the Chinese government is really afraid of Jimmy Lai.
I think they're afraid of having somebody who's not afraid of them. The best thing that they can have are people who are arrested and who choose to stay quiet and silent and please just let me out, I'll do anything. That sort of attitude is the best thing for them, because then they have lots of guilty pleading around the arrested individuals. They have lots of guilty pleas. They can say, look, we've done our job in the courts work, we arrested them, they got sentenced, everything is fine. Jimmy Lai has been a nightmare for them. You know, the fact that they tried so hard not to get him on the stand. They didn't want the lawyer they denied him the lawyer that he wanted. The fact that his trial keeps being delayed, the fact that he's in solitary confinement so that he can't talk to other prisoners, because imagine, God forbid, he speaks to people and he actually criticizes the authorities and they tell their friends and family and so on and on. So I think that they're terrified, but it's no different to President Putin in Russia. You know, what did he do with Navalny and Karamurza and all these other prominent, outspoken people? You jail them because you're frightened of the fact that they may inspire others, that they may galvanize others. The irony is you bring more attention to the fact that you're oppressing people. So Xi Jinping hasn't learned anything from Putin. He hasn't learned anything from Iran or Belarus or Venezuela or any of these other dictatorships, where the worst thing you can do is take famous people and throw them in prison. That just keeps the light shining on the issue.
On November 27th, the European Parliament issued a joint motion for a resolution on Hong Kong, condemning the sentencing of pro-democracy activists on national security charges in violation of international law. The Parliament calls for the repeal of the National Security Law and the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance. The Parliament denounced the degradation of basic freedoms in Hong Kong and urged the Hong Kong government to immediately and unconditionally release all pro-democracy activists, including Jimmy Lai.
So the resolution basically highlights the injustices as seen from the European perspective of the sentencing of Jimmy Lai and the 45 and calling on them for their immediate release. I think what's significant is that we are seeing parliaments around the world passing resolutions and motions and having hearings and committee meetings and debates in the name of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. And what's significant is that many of these countries have no official ties or links to Hong Kong. In the United Kingdom, you could say, fair enough, there's lots of history with the United Kingdom. But why is Canada doing so? Or why is America taking such a lead? European countries are passing resolutions. Italy, their House of Deputies passed a resolution earlier this year. We've seen it in Europe a couple of times. And what it shows is that the situation in Hong Kong is no longer just about Hong Kong. It's a global issue about democracy versus dictatorship. Just like Russia, just like Belarus, just like Venezuela, just like Iran. Now, people are openly seeing that it's exactly the same. So in the same way that the European Parliament might pass a resolution condemning the sentencing of women for removing their hijab in Iran, or they might condemn the death of Navalny in Russia, and so on and on, now they're including Hong Kong in that. So the axis of authoritarian regimes have now, all sort of worked together to such an extent that other countries are starting to block them altogether. There's no reason in theory for individual European member states to care about Jimmy Lai. And yet he's become so symbolic and so famous. And the cause of Hong Kong has become a real front line of freedom versus dictatorship.
A real front line of freedom versus dictatorship. Is the democratic world doing enough?
From my perspective, absolutely not. We've seen over the last 10 years a very steady rise of authoritarians at the same time as an increasing diminishing in some democracies. We've seen democracies elect more extreme leaders on all sides. And those extreme leaders tend to line up with authoritarian values. Otherwise, how do you keep your position? So whether it's the far left or whether you're the far right, all of that ties into building alliances and networks with people that you don't like. So democracy is for sure under threat. Democracy is weak at the moment. Democracies became very complacent since the turn of the century, since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Many Western democracies became a bit complacent. It was, democracy won, that's the end of everything else. And of course, it's not. And what we've seen is that technology has allowed dictatorships to work together. Cryptocurrencies have allowed dictatorships to move money around the world without them being frozen in different banks. Organizations like BRICS, which should have been a really positive trading bloc for countries, is now becoming an alliance of countries who deem themselves as being treated badly by the West. And they're working together and they're talking about setting up their own currency and their own trading blocs. And so we are seeing a diminishing of democracy at the same time as we see the rise of authoritarians. The question is, to the European Union, to the United States, to Canada, to Britain, to Australia, to New Zealand, what are we going to do to stand up for democratic values? What are we going to do to change the way we deal with those authoritarian regimes? And very importantly, how do we deal with all the countries who are caught in the middle? How do we make sure that all the little countries, as you might say, the middle countries in Africa, in Asia, in South America, who are being pulled in one direction or the other, how do you make sure that they remain on the side of freedom and democracy and don't start seeing shiny glitter by choosing China or Russia or Iran as your partner? So we are absolutely in an ideological battle for freedom and democracy at the moment.
And in this ideological battle for freedom and democracy, here's Mark's message for the Hong Kong authorities and Xi Jinping.
Relieve the pressure on yourselves. Release Jimmy Lai and his family. Release at least some of the political prisoners. There are 1,900 political prisoners in Hong Kong, 1,000 still sitting in jail. I mean, these numbers are huge. That's like Myanmar, Cambodia, Iran, these sorts of places. Release the pressure on yourselves. If you want to have a normal relationship with the United Kingdom, with America, with Europe, with Canada, you can't keep people in prison the way you do. You can't arrest people for writing news articles or for blogging. They should immediately release Jimmy Lai. They should immediately remove the sentences of the 45 and say, you've served your time, just leave now. Also, in the case of Jimmy Lai, he's turning 77 in a few days' time. He's diabetic, he's not getting the treatment he wants. He's been in solitary confinement for 4 years, one of the longest standing people in solitary confinement. Even the UN has passed a resolution saying that's tantamount to torture. And of course, on the religious front, he's not getting the religious freedom that he wants in prison. So they have so many reasons to alleviate some of the pressure by releasing Jimmy Lai, allowing him to be with his family, and releasing some other political prisoners. And if they would just think sensibly about the impact that would have on other countries, you would not see resolutions being passed all over the world. You remove the cause of your headache and you relieve the pressure on yourself. Britain is committed to raising the case of Jimmy Lai at every single bilateral meeting, no matter what level of minister. If the Chinese find that embarrassing or frustrating, release Jimmy Lai, then there won't be an issue on the agenda. So It's a time when there is something to be done. There is still a space for a little bit of clear thinking, and there is space for a little bit for people who are carrying out their legitimate rights to assembly and free speech to be released from prison and to allow a little bit of normality to return to Hong Kong.